tonight, in the hush between one heartbeat and the next, let me draw you gently into a world that once trembled beneath its own shadow. Rest your thoughts beside me for a moment, as though we sit near a single candle whose flame sways with the smallest sigh. Imagine the kind of darkness that does not frighten, but listens, quietly, patiently, like an old friend waiting to share a secret. And as the night settles its weight upon the earth, allow me to guide you toward a time when England breathed differently, slower, heavier, a time when every whisper felt like a warning, and every rustle of wind carried a question no one dared to answer aloud. Picture England in the 15th century. Fields wrapped in mist so thick it seemed to cling to the bones. Cottages built of timber that groaned whenever the cold touched them, and villages that slept lightly as though afraid of their own dreams. The church bells in those days rang not only to gather the faithful, but to remind them that sin was always watching from somewhere unseen. Priests spoke in tones that trembled between hope and dread, promising salvation while painting the world as a battlefield between heaven's stern light and the devil's patient claws. And in the dim glow of hearth fires, families huddled close as if distance itself were enough to invite misfortune. Life felt fragile, like a thin thread stretched across a valley of unseen dangers. Fear was not a sudden visitor back then. No, it grew slowly, rooted in crop failure, in strange illnesses, in long winters that overstayed their welcome like uninvited ghosts. When a cow died unexpectedly or a child cried through the night without reason, the villagers looked not to chance, but to something darker. They whispered of curses, of unseen hand stirring trouble. Sometimes a lonely widow became the subject of these fearful conversations, sometimes a midwife whose herbal brews worked a little too well. Imagine sitting at a wooden table, the firelight quivering across your face, while your neighbors murmured about omens and shadows that followed the wrong people. Even a harmless glance could become a crime if it met the wrong pair of eyes. Across these villages, stories traveled faster than truth. A pot breaking on its own might turn into a tale of possession by morning. A sick goat became a sign that someone had bargained with forces unholy. It almost makes one smile, softly, sadly, at how the human heart, when frightened, can convince itself that even the simplest misfortune carries the devil's signature. But in those days, humor was cautious, like a bird perched on a shaking branch. And so people listened more to rumors than to reason. They watched their neighbors closely, collecting suspicions as though they were gathering firewood for a winter that seemed never to end. So, let us settle into this dark English night together, as though we sit on the edge of a tale half remembered by the earth itself. The air is ripe with old prayers and older fears. In the distance, a church bell echoes, slow, solemn, as though unsure whether it's calling the faithful or warning them. This is where our story begins, in a land where faith and dread walked hand in hand, where the devil was blamed for every sorrow, and where the smallest spark of suspicion could light a pyre. Breathe slowly now, for the path ahead grows colder, and the shadows, they remember everything.
In those days, the church stood at the center of every village, quiet, tall, and solemn, like a guardian carved from stone in scripture. Its walls carried centuries of breath and prayer, and its windows glowed faintly whenever dawn tried to press its gentle fingers through the mist. But beneath all that sanctity, there lived another presence, something less heavenly, more human, shaped by worries that clung like cobwebs to the rafters. The villagers walked toward the church with hope in their chests, yet bowed with the fear that heaven was always watching with a stern and measuring gaze. And so the church became not just a sanctuary, but a silent judge towering over hearts that had little room for comfort. Enter side with me for a moment, quietly, so the echoes do not rise too sharply. Imagine the wooden pews polished by countless trembling hands, and the scent of old incense lingering like a memory that refuses to fade. The priest's voice, deep and slow, rolled through the nave like distant thunder, warning the flock of the devil's tricks. He spoke of temptation that hid in plain sight, of spirits that wandered fields, and of witches who wore the faces of ordinary women. His words, though meant to protect, often planted seeds of dread that grew faster than any blessing could soothe. And the people, weary from toil and misfortune, found themselves listening not out of devotion, but out of fear of what might happen if they didn't. Outside the church, the world felt bigger and wilder, winds that moaned across the moors, forests that seemed to swallow light, and nights so dark they almost felt alive. The villagers believed the church was the only barrier between them and whatever lurked beyond the boundaries of reason. Every illness, every misstep, every unexpected sorrow seemed to push them closer to the priest, begging for answers. And though the priest spoke of God's mercy, his sermons were often painted with warnings sharper than the cold. "Beware the devil's servants, for they wear familiar faces," he would say. One could almost imagine the villagers turning to glance at their neighbors, wondering who among them was hiding a secret pact beneath a polite smile. It was a strange kind of devotion, half faith, half trembling suspicion. The church, instead of calming their fears, began to bind them in tighter knots. And yet they returned day after day, believing that only divine light could keep their fragile world from sinking into chaos. The priest, wrapped in heavy robes, became the voice of judgment and reassurance all at once. He warned them about signs, the crooked branch on a door, a whisper heard at dawn, a woman who gathered herbs beneath the moon. Even harmless acts began to look suspicious under the church's watchful gaze. The boundary between blessing and panic blurred like ink left in the rain. So here we stand, in a land where the church's shadow stretched farther than its promise, where holy words sometimes trembled with fear rather than grace. The villagers clung to faith as though it were the last rope above a bottomless well, unaware that the very place they trusted would soon ignite a storm no prayer could calm. The night grows heavier now, and the candles flicker as if uneasy. For from the heart of this sacred house, the next chapter of dread would quietly rise, shaping men who believed they were chosen to hunt the darkness, even when the darkness lived in their own hearts. In those quiet villages, fear seldom announced itself with thunder or flame. No, it slipped in gently, like frost settling on a window, slow enough to be ignored until the world awoke shivering. It began with whispers, small, careless things tossed between neighbors while tending goats or fetching water at dawn. A woman's name spoken with hesitation, a story retold with one detail added, then another, until it no longer resembled truth at all. Imagine a group of villagers gathered near a well, their breaths rising in pale clouds, their voices lowered not out of courtesy, but dread. "They say she speaks to the wind," someone murmurs. "They say her eyes glow at night," adds another. In a place where hardship hung thick as smoke, even the gentlest rumor could become a spark in dry grass.
there was always someone who seemed just a little different, too quiet, too bold, too kind, or simply too unlucky. Perhaps she lived alone at the edge of the woods where the trees whispered secrets no priest ever taught. Perhaps her garden grew herbs that cured fevers better than prayers. Or perhaps she had a gaze that lingered too long, not because she meant harm, but because she carried too many thoughts to hide them neatly. These small quirks, harmless under the sun of a kinder age, became signs of danger in a world ruled by suspicion. And so, day by day, the village watched her with growing unease, as if expecting the devil himself to step out from behind her shadow. But fear is a peculiar creature. It feeds on what it imagines more eagerly than what it sees. A cow that stopped producing milk became evidence. A sudden storm was considered a curse. A child waking with a nightmare was treated as a prophecy. People began to stitch these coincidences together like a patchwork quilt, convinced they were unveiling an unseen truth. Of course, had reason knocked politely on their doors, it might have reminded them that life is often messy without any supernatural help. But reason walks softly, and in those days, fear walked louder. Even the children sensed it. They ran past certain cottages without looking back, clutching their toys as though a pair of unseen hands might reach through the air to claim them. Occasionally, the woman accused would try to defend herself, speaking gently, raising her hands as though surrendering to a storm she could not see. "I did nothing," she'd insist, her voice trembling, not from guilt, but from being surrounded by people she once trusted. Yet her pleas only deepened their suspicions. Innocence, after all, can sound suspicious when ears refuse to listen. A villager might lean to another and whisper, "Hear how she trembles? The devil makes his servants tremble when they lie." Even the simplest sob could be mistaken for a confession, and so her world shrank, hour by hour, until even silence could be twisted into proof. Thus, the first wounds of this dark age were not carved by executioners, nor ordered by courts. They were shaped quietly, crafted by gossip and fear, carried from door to door like a cursed heirloom no one dared refuse. And from these wounds, deeper tragedies would soon rise. Tragedies that would sweep across England like a cold wind slipping beneath every cottage door. So let us walk carefully now, for the path ahead grows sharper, and in the distance the torchlight of the first hunters flickers faintly, waiting for the moment when rumor becomes accusation, and accusation becomes fate.
There came a season when the earth refused to be gentle. The crops, once green and proud, bowed their heads far too early, as though surrendering to a grief no farmer could name. Rain arrived when the villagers begged for sun, and when they prayed for rain, the sky turned its back and left the fields cracking under the weight of drought. Misfortune settled over the countryside like a thick shawl, heavy and unwelcome. And in that uneasy silence, the villagers searched for meaning, because the human heart, frightened and weary, will cling to any explanation rather than admit the world is sometimes cruel without reason. And so, slowly, the question began to rise among them. Who had angered God, or worse, invited something darker? When the first livestock fell ill, stumbling in their pens as if chased by invisible claws, suspicion began weaving itself like ivy around certain names. If a chicken died after drinking bad water, someone muttered a familiar woman's name. If bread failed to rise, someone else repeated it, softer this time, as if afraid the wind might carry the rumor back to her. A child's fever, a broken tool, a fire that sparked too quickly. Each misfortune became another stone placed on a growing pile of imagined evidence. The villagers gathered by the tavern door at dusk, their faces lined by worry, their voices low enough to seem cautious, but loud enough to spread fear like a stain.
It cannot be chance, one would say. It cannot be the weather. And no one dared answer with the truth that life often dances to no one's tune at all. What made their fear more potent was the church's steady reminder that the devil was always near, waiting for weak souls to become his doorway. A sermon spoken on a cold morning became the match that lit their anxieties into flame. The priest lifted his hands and warned them that Satan's servants preferred to work in secrecy, blending into the crowd with humble smiles and harmless faces. "Look to your troubles," he said, "for they reveal the footprints of evil." And though his voice trembled with conviction rather than cruelty, the villagers heard something deeper, a silent permission to assign blame, to turn their grief into accusation. The woman who brewed herbal teas, the widow who walked alone at twilight, the midwife whose cures seemed too miraculous, they were suddenly cast as characters in a drama they never asked to join. Inevitably, as their world shrank under fear's tightening grip, the villagers began watching the woman more closely. They noticed things they'd ignored for years, the way she paused to listen to the wind, the herbs hanging from her doorway, the stray cat that liked her porch. Each innocent detail became a puzzle piece that fit neatly into the picture fear wished to paint. And sometimes, late at night, they spoke to each other as though her guilt was already carved in stone. One man recalled seeing her murmur to herself in the woods, never mind that she'd been praying. Another swore he felt a shiver when she passed him, never mind that winter had arrived early. Suspicion, once started, needs very little truth to keep walking. And so misfortune, carried on the back of storms and sickness, began to wear her face, unfairly, quietly, and almost inevitably. The villagers did not yet speak of punishment, not openly, but their glances grew sharper, their voices more cautious, and their prayers more desperate. Something was building, like thunder gathering behind distant hills, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to call it what it wasn't. The night grows colder now, and even the wind seems to hesitate before passing through these troubled villages. For soon, misfortune alone would no longer satisfy their fear. Soon, they would seek a culprit, and the hunt would truly begin.
Her name, let us whisper it gently, for she carried no weapon but kindness, was Eleanor Hartwell, a woman whose life had always moved with the quiet rhythm of the earth. She lived in a small cottage stitched to the edge of the woods, where birdsong softened the mornings and the scent of herbs lingered like a shy greeting from her garden. For years, the villagers had come to her doorstep seeking remedies for fevers, aches, and restless infants. Her hands were steady, her voice calm, and her knowledge deep enough to ease the burdens of a hard land. But when fear claimed the countryside, even kindness became suspicious, and the very skills that once made Eleanor beloved now stood as silent accusations. And so, she became the first target of the village's unease, chosen not for guilt, but for convenience. It began on a gray morning when the baker's son fell gravely ill. His breathing came in shallow waves, and his skin burned with a fever no prayer seemed able to cool. In panic, the baker ran to Eleanor's cottage, pleading for help. She brewed a simple tisane, mint, willow bark, and a touch of honey, whispering a soft encouragement as she pressed the cup to the boy's lips. The child did grow calmer, but not quickly enough for his father's frantic heart. And when the boy's condition wavered later that night, the baker, exhausted and desperate, let fear twist his grief into accusation. "She gave him something strange," he muttered at the tavern, his voice trembling like a candle in a draught. "Something unnatural." By morning, his uncertain words had grown roots and branches, repeated from porch to porch until the tale no longer resembled the truth. Eleanor noticed the shift long before anyone dared speak to her directly. The friendly nods she once received became cautious half-glances. The mothers who had trusted her remedies pulled their children close whenever she passed. Even the church, once a place where she found solace, now felt colder when she stepped inside. The priest's eyes lingered at her a beat too long,
and his sermons grew sharper, speaking of false healers, of women who wove shadows into their cures. She knew the words were directed at her, though no one mentioned her name. Fear has a way of speaking without pointing, and Eleanor, wrapped in loneliness she did not deserve, walked home that day with the uneasy sense that she stood upon a thinning ledge above a deep and hungry suspicion. Her cottage, once a refuge of warmth, became the center of watchful eyes. One evening, as she gathered herbs outside, she noticed villagers pausing on the road, whispering behind their hands. A pair of boys dared each other to run past her fence. A woman she had once helped crossed herself dramatically before turning away. And all the while, the rumors grew. They said Eleanor's garden thrived even when others swithered. They said she spoke to the moon, that her cat understood her words, that she could cure a child's fever with nothing but a touch. None of these things were true, yet truth mattered little in the presence of fear. It is frightening how easily suspicion can overshadow memory, how quickly gratitude dissolves when people grow desperate for someone to blame. Thus, Eleanor became the village's unspoken suspect, chosen not for wickedness, but for standing just far enough outside their comfort. Misfortune had found a face to wear, and the villagers, though uneasy, began to feel a strange relief, as though naming a victim gave shape to their chaotic world. But the danger had only begun to stir, like embers beneath ash waiting for a breath of wind. And somewhere beyond the hills, a man would soon rise who knew exactly how to fan such embers into flames. For every witch hunt needs its hunter, and England was about to meet her first.
There is a cruel kind of silence that settles when a community decides someone no longer belongs. Eleanor felt it long before any accusation was spoken aloud, felt it in the way footsteps halted when she walked by, in the way conversations dropped like stones the moment she entered a room. Even the air around her seemed to tighten, as though holding its breath. A week earlier, she had been a neighbor, a healer, a familiar figure moving gently through the village paths. Now, she was a question no one wished to answer. When she approached the market, vendors suddenly found reasons to busy their hands, rearranging baskets or pretending not to notice her soft greeting. And though she tried to smile, the village responded with wary glances, as if a single expression might reveal the darkness they had convinced themselves lived within her. Children, once fond of her stories and sweet remedies, began to hide behind their mother's skirts when she passed. Their small faces peeked out with a mixture of curiosity and fear, as though she might transform into a raven the moment they blinked. Adults whispered that she carried a charm hidden beneath her shawl, some talisman of unholy power. A missing hen became evidence. A broken cartwheel became a sign. Even the weather conspired against her in their eyes. When a sudden gust of wind blew through the village square one afternoon, sending a flurry of dust spiraling, someone muttered, "Did you see? It started when she walked by." And just like that, a harmless breeze became another thread in the tapestry of suspicion that wrapped tightly around her name. Eleanor tried to keep her dignity close, wearing it like a cloak even when her heart felt exposed. But dignity can be a fragile companion when every glance cuts like a blade. One morning, she entered the church, hoping for comfort, hoping the familiar wooden pews might offer even a sliver of warmth. Instead, the congregation shrank away from her, as if her presence carried some unseen contagion. The priest paused mid-sermon, his eyes settling on her with a heaviness that made her chest tighten. "There are those among us," he said slowly, "who walk with gifts that do not come from God." He never spoke her name, yet the silence that followed shaped her silhouette more clearly than any word could. Eleanor lowered her gaze, praying not for protection from demons, but from her neighbors. By now, the rumors had grown roots so deep that even kindness looked suspicious. When Eleanor helped an elderly man lift a fallen jug at the well, the onlookers exchanged uneasy glances, certain she had touched him to cast some hidden spell.
When she offered bread to a hungry child, the mother pulled the little one away, whispering a prayer under her breath. Eleanor's world shrank to the size of her cottage door frame, and even there she felt watched, as if every herb she hung was another reason for the village to turn its back on her. A place that once felt like home now echoed with fear others projected onto her. And still, she said nothing. Because what defense can a gentle soul offer when those around her have already chosen the ending to her story? Thus the days passed, heavy and trembling, until the village no longer saw Eleanor as a woman at all, only as a vessel for the anxieties they could not name. Their eyes judged before her lips could form a single word, and every breath she took seemed to confirm the guilt they had invented. The darkness they feared now lived not in the woods or the storms, but in the fragile silhouette of a woman standing alone against a rising tide. And in that tide, something ominous began to stir. An authority, a force, a self-appointed savior. For the village's fear was no longer wandering blindly. It was seeking structure. It was seeking leadership. And soon, England would give it a man who believed he was chosen to cleanse the land of shadows.
Tonight, as the hush of evening settles upon your room, allow me to guide you into the quieter chambers of England's past, those places where torches burned low, where whispers curled like smoke, and where choices were made far from the roar of the battlefield. For history is not forged by swords alone. Sometimes it turns upon the softest footstep in a dim corridor. In those years when Lancaster and York glared at each other across a trembling kingdom, many believed the struggle was only fought by kings and lords astride their steeds. Yet beneath the crown's golden weight lay webs of doubt, ambition, and fear, strings pulled by hands unseen. Come closer and listen gently, for secrets often speak in a voice barely louder than a sigh. Within the royal households, life moved with the polished grace of ceremony, though beneath the surface lay currents strong enough to pull a kingdom apart. Servants traded stories as they polished goblets. Ladies-in-waiting stitched quiet rumors into their embroidery. Guards leaned on their spears, pretending not to hear the murmurs that slid between stone pillars. Even the tapestries seemed to hold their breath, as if they too sensed the shifting loyalties behind the velvet curtains. King Henry VI wandered through these halls with the innocence of a man born gentle in a world far too sharp for him, his mind drifting between clarity and cloud, his crown sometimes feeling heavier than the sky. Some pitied him, others feared the vacuum his softness created, and a few sharpened ambitions in the shadows, hoping the candle of his reign would flicker just long enough to seize their chance. Among those shadows walked Richard, Duke of York, a man whose stillness often spoke louder than another's thunder. His eyes measured everything with the calm of someone who knew storms would soon begin, whether he wished for them or not. At times, in the quiet of night, one might imagine him speaking softly to himself. If the kingdom cannot stand as it is, then let it be rebuilt, properly this time. He was not cruel, though neither was he gentle. He held a spine carved by hardship and a patience that could outwait the moon's own cycles. And while he moved with dignity, the whispers around him danced like restless spirits. Pretender, savior, usurper, rightful heir. Each word a spark, each spark a danger. The castle floors remembered every rumor. Stone never forgets. But even those who believed themselves wise could not grasp how deeply fate had already dipped its brush into the palette of coming years. Ambition swept not only through nobles, but through households big and small. A blacksmith in Coventry muttered that the realm needed firmer hands. A shepherd boy in Yorkshire swore he saw omens in the stars. Tavern storytellers exchanged tales of prophecies written in dust. England was weary, like an old traveler longing for rest, yet forced to march again and again. And through that weariness, two pillars continued to glow like distant embers, red and white. Their meanings grew heavier with each passing season, until even a simple rose no longer felt like a flower, but a decision. So the stage darkened, the players readied themselves, and the kingdom waited breathlessly for the next turning of the wheel. But before the thunder of battles returned, before banners snapped in harsh winds, and families pledged lives they could not afford to lose, there was this stillness, this fragile interlude where history paused as if unsure which path to take. Stay with me in this hush, for the quiet before a storm often reveals more truth than the storm itself. And now, with your breath steady and your thoughts drifting like soft river mist, let us step gently into the next chapter, where choices sharpen, shadows lengthen, and the colors of loyalty finally begin to burn. Tonight, as night settles with the gentleness of an old friend drawing a blanket over weary shoulders, allow me to guide you into a moment when England's breath seemed to slow. When the kingdom, fragile as a candle in a draught, waited for a voice that had not yet dared to rise. In those dimly lit years, while kings faltered and nobles quarreled, a question moved through the land like a wandering ghost. Who truly should lead? It drifted through marketplaces, lingered in monasteries, and even curled through humble cottages where families prayed for a steadier dawn. And though few said it aloud, many felt a subtle pull toward one man whose lineage shimmered like a half-remembered song. Richard, Duke of York, whose claim whispered beneath the louder clamor of politics. Come closer, dear listener, and rest your thoughts. We are entering a moment where silence shaped destiny. The Duke himself was no brash pretender. If ambition troubled him, it did so quietly, pacing like a thoughtful companion beside him. In the stillness of his private chambers, where candles quivered as though wary of their own shadows, Richard would study ancient genealogies, those branching lines that tied him not just to power, but to legacy. His ancestors stretched proudly back through the royal houses, their names carved into the kingdom's memory like weathered scripture. And while a lesser man might boast of such heritage, Richard wore it like a sober cloak. He did not declare his intent. He simply existed in a world that grew increasingly uncomfortable with his potential. Even the courtiers, with their polished shoes and polished smiles, felt an unease around him, like standing near a sleeping lion, unsure whether it dreamed of peace or conquest. Outside York's quiet dignity, England itself seemed to listen. In towns where merchants haggled over wool and wine, debates flared in playful whispers. If not Henry, then who? Some chuckled nervously, as though treating treason like a joke would make it less sharp. Others lowered their voices, glancing over their shoulders in fear that loose words might find the wrong ears. Even children, too young to understand crowns or lineage, played games where they crowned each other with wreaths of thorns and daisies, echoing the uncertainty of the age. And as these murmurs multiplied, they formed a river of thought running beneath the surface, quiet, persistent, impossible to stop once it found its course. England was changing, not with shouts or steel, but with a slow awakening that felt almost like the land itself was choosing. Meanwhile, Queen Margaret, fierce as a winter wind, sensed the shifting tide. Though she moved with royal grace, her heart burned with a fire strong enough to warm a kingdom or scorch it. Her husband's gentle fragility had become her burden and her armor, and she guarded his crown with the devotion of a lioness.
Many nights, as moonlight touched the battlements, she stood in silent worry, imagining threats carved from rumor and shadow. And indeed, the threat was real, yet subtle. Not a rebellion raised in open daylight, but a thought that spread in the quiet corners of England's soul. Perhaps the realm deserved a steadier hand. Her resolve hardened because she knew that ideas, once born, do not die. They only wait. And so the kingdom drifted into a fragile dreamscape. Warm candles glowing behind frosted windows, weary prayers rising from quiet hearths, and nobles watching one another with the caution of wolves circling in snow. No battle had yet begun, but the calm felt stretched too thin, like silk about to tear. York's claim remained unspoken, yet everywhere felt its echo. Tonight, as you rest in this tale, let the softness of the moment settle around you, for soon the hush will shatter, and England will awaken with a roar. But not yet, not in this gentle breath between storms.
In those uneasy years, the heart of England did not beat within its cities or its castles, but within the fragile chest of one man, King Henry VI. His reign, gentle as a prayer whispered by trembling lips, carried a sweetness rare among rulers. Yet sweetness, though comforting, is not always strong enough to hold a kingdom steady. There were nights when Henry sat upon his throne with the calm of a saint carved from wood, still, silent, almost untouched by the world around him. Courtiers watched with growing dread as the king stared past them, his eyes soft but empty, like a candle flickering in daylight. Some said he was blessed, others whispered he was cursed, and those with sharper tongues murmured that England was no longer ruled by a king, but by his shadows. When the king's mind slipped into quiet darkness, the kingdom followed. Decisions hung unanswered in the air, laws waited like neglected children. Even the murmuring marketplace felt the tremor of uncertainty, as though the land itself held its breath. Priests prayed harder, nobles argued louder, and the common folk, poor souls with more worries than sleep, wondered whether heaven had turned its face away. In this drifting haze of leadership, Richard of York found himself drawn, unwillingly perhaps, into the empty space left behind. The council sought him, the realm leaned toward him, and though he protested that he desired only stability, not a crown, even the stones of Westminster seemed to whisper that destiny rarely asks for permission. One winter morning, when frost painted every rooftop with delicate lace, the king fell into a stillness deeper than any before. For days he spoke not a word, not even his breath seemed to belong to him. Queen Margaret hovered at his bedside like a sentinel carved from grief and iron. Physicians muttered half-remembered remedies, monks chanted hymns that trembled with fear, yet nothing stirred the king's spirit. Outside, snowflakes drifted softly, and in that silence the council made a decision that changed the kingdom's course. They named Richard of York Protector of the Realm, a title wrapped in duty, but also in implication. When the news reached the villages, people spoke of it the way they spoke of storms, some hopeful, some afraid, all sensing that the weather was about to change. York accepted the mantle not with joy, but with the solemn air of a man who knows he is stepping into a room filled with fragile glass. He moved through court with calm dignity, making order where chaos had taken root. The laws breathed again, the treasury steadied, even the nobles behaved, for a time. And yet, beneath that fragile peace, a quiet unease curled like smoke beneath a door. For every man who saw York as a savior, there was another who saw him as a usurper waiting to bloom.
Queen Margaret's eyes sharpened, her posture stiffened, and her grief-forged resolve hardened into something fierce enough to split stone. She recognized a truth the council tried to ignore. A kingdom cannot serve two hearts, even if one sleeps. Thus England drifted into a strange twilight, ruled by a king lost within his own mind, guided by a duke who never asked for a crown, and watched by a queen who feared both God's silence and man's ambition. Villagers felt it in the wind, monks read it in their scriptures. Even the crows circling above the fields seemed restless. A shift was coming, listening friend, a shift that would turn whispered doubts into clashing steel. But before swords were drawn, before banners rose, the kingdom lingered in this fragile breath between loyalty and longing. Rest with me here a moment, in this thin and trembling peace, because when it breaks, England will echo with a roar that shapes generations.
There are queens who rule with jewels, and queens who rule with grace. But Margaret of Anjou ruled with something far older and far sharper, a devotion that burned like iron in a blacksmith's fire. On nights when the court slept beneath velvet darkness, she paced the length of her chambers with the steady rhythm of a storm gathering its strength. Outside, the castle torches flickered as though bracing themselves against her resolve. Within those stone walls, Margaret whispered to herself, not prayers, not laments, but promises. Promises that her husband would not be replaced. Promises that her son would not be cast aside by ambitious hands. And as she moved through the shadows, her presence felt less like a woman and more like a force of nature, cold, determined, and utterly unwilling to yield. She had watched Richard of York accept the title of protector with the calm dignity of a man who believed he acted for the realm's good. But to Margaret, that calm was the most dangerous thing of all. She saw in York not a guardian, but a quiet threat, a candle placed too close to the throne's ancient tapestries. In her eyes, the council had not appointed a helper, they had invited a rival. And so Margaret began to gather her allies the way a spider gathers threads, weaving a web strong enough to catch even the most restless ambition. Letters were sent under moonlight, meetings held in rooms thick with incense and suspicion, and whispers traveled like restless ghosts from manor to manor, calling those still loyal to the crown, and to her. Beyond the castle walls, Margaret's determination stirred the land. In marketplaces where merchants argued over apples and wool, tongues wagged with fresh rumors. The queen is raising men, some said. She's preparing for war, murmured others, almost afraid to shape the words. Though many knew nothing of politics, they understood a mother's fury, and Margaret's love for her child was the kind of love that could carve mountains. Even the soldiers she summoned spoke of her with a peculiar reverence. "She looks at you," one man said, "as if she can see the truth buried behind your ribs." And perhaps she could, for Margaret fought not merely for power, but for the fragile thread binding her family to the crown. Yet, even as she gathered strength, Margaret felt the weight of the kingdom pressing upon her like a cold hand on her shoulder. There were nights when she stood beside her husband's still form, gazing down at the gentle king who seemed lost in places beyond her reach. She touched his hand, warm yet unresponsive, and felt both love and resentment tangled like thorny vines within her chest. Henry's purity had once seemed a blessing, a balm upon the kingdom's wounds. But now, in this age of steel and suspicion, purity had turned into a burden, one she alone was strong enough to carry. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, not tenderly, but with the solemnity of a vow renewed.
And so the queen stepped forth from grief and into destiny, her will as sharp as winter's first bite. While York stabilized the realm, Margaret gathered its storms. While he restored order, she prepared for the chaos she believed necessary to reclaim what was hers. Two forces now moved across England's trembling stage, one steady, one fierce, one cautious, one blazing. One born of duty, the other of unyielding love. The kingdom felt the tension like a drawn bowstring, vibrating softly in the dark. And you, dear listener, may rest here for a breath, for soon this string will snap, and England will awaken to the thunder of a conflict long whispered in corridors and dreams.
In history, dear listener, when a kingdom seems to drift beneath two suns, each casting its own light, each demanding its own loyalty, England, in those trembling years, lived beneath such dual brilliance. On one side stood Richard of York, steady as a carved oak, guiding the realm with a calm hand. On the other shone Queen Margaret, fierce as dawn breaking through storm clouds. Their lights did not mingle, they clashed, casting long shadows across villages, across courts, even across the quiet chambers where mothers whispered prayers for peace. And as the people looked upward, unsure which sun to follow, the sky itself seemed to crack with tension. A delicate calm stretched over England, too thin, too soft, like ice waiting for the first careless footstep. In London's winding streets, merchants exchanged more than coins. They traded stories. York brings order, one would say, weighing wool with practiced hands. Aye, but a crown cannot rest on a borrowed name. In taverns thick with the scent of smoke and last night's ale, men argued in voices kept barely above a whisper. Some claimed loyalty to the queen, moved by her fire, her devotion, her refusal to bend. Others saw strength in York, his lineage, his clarity, his quiet courage. Yet most, caught between fear and hope, simply longed for a king who could wake from his dusk-bound silence. Their words drifted like restless embers, rising into the cold night, carrying the heartbeat of a nation unsure of its fate. Meanwhile, York himself felt the weight of England pressing upon him like a heavy cloak. Though protector in name, he walked the corridors with the careful grace of a man stepping across cracked glass. Every decision he made seemed to ripple outward, brushing against nerves already stretched too thin. Advisors urged him toward boldness, friends whispered of the crown, enemies watched his every breath. Yet York, ever measured, ever cautious, clung to the hope that duty alone might steady the realm. Sometimes, in quiet moments, when candlelight painted gentle gold across the walls, he wondered if destiny truly sought him, or if it merely cornered him as prey. For even lions, when cornered, must bare their teeth. Far from the capital, in the warmth of small cottages where firelight danced upon wooden beams, families felt the shift in ways softer but no less real. Farmers noticed the travelers spoke more urgently. Mothers tightened blankets around their children when unfamiliar riders passed. Even the forest seemed to listen, as though the wind carried rumors too heavy for human minds alone. And yet, amid this unease, life continued with its quiet courage. Bread still rose in clay ovens. Children still chased geese across muddy fields. But beneath those simple rhythms pulsed a question, steady and unnerving. What happens when two powers pull the kingdom in opposite directions? It was a question no plow, no prayer, no hearth could answer. And so, England drifted into a tension that hummed like a bowstring drawn too tight, waiting for a single spark to release its stored fury. A queen who would not yield, a duke who could not step back, a king lost within his own soft silence, three hearts shaping the course of a nation. The people felt it in their sleep,
The churches felt it in their solemn hymns. Even the ravens circling above the fields seemed to sense a storm building just beyond the horizon. Rest here with me, just for a moment, in this breath before thunder. The next steps England takes will shake the earth beneath its feet.
There comes a night, dear listener, when even the gentlest kingdom feels the shiver of metal waking from slumber. When the first sword, long kept at rest, stirs softly within its scabbard. England reached such a night when the quiet tension between York and Margaret tightened like a rope pulled from both ends. The courtiers felt it first, their laughter growing thin, their greetings edged with caution. Even the torches in the palace halls seemed to burn with a nervous flicker, as though they sensed the nearing storm. And in the hush beneath vaulted ceilings, servants paused mid-step, catching whispers that tasted of treason or justice, depending on the listener. It was the kind of night where a single breath could tilt history, and England exhaled, trembling. The spark came not from a battlefield, but from a meeting, one meant to soothe the growing rift. Imagine a hall filled with nobles whose smiles were polished, but whose eyes betrayed suspicion. Queen Margaret, clad in a red so deep it seemed carved from the heart of a sunset, stood with the fire of a woman who had buried her fear long ago. Beside her, the king sat silent, distant, his features gentle, yet fading like an old memory. Across from them, Richard of York bowed with the dignity of a man who respected the crown, even as the crown no longer fully trusted him. Their words, soft at first, soon clashed with the force of unsheathed blades. No shouts, no insults, just a steady tightening of wills, each refusing to bow to the other. Margaret, sharp as a winter gale, demanded York step aside from the protectorate. "The king has me," she said, her voice smooth as silk sharpened on stone. Her gaze cut through the hall, daring anyone to disagree. But York had learned that duty, once accepted, clings fiercely to a man's conscience. "My service belongs to England," he answered, calm, steady, dangerously honest. And with that, something fragile cracked. Nobles exchanged glances, some hopeful, others wary. The hall felt suddenly smaller, as though its walls leaned inward to listen. Fate, mischievous as ever, perched on the shoulders of the gathered lords, delighted to see which way the wind would turn. When the meeting dispersed, it was with the kind of silence usually reserved for funerals and storms. Riders sped off into the twilight, carrying letters sealed in wax that melted quickly over anxious flames. Banners were lifted from dusty chests. Armor long ignored was polished until it shone like a warning. Across the countryside, the restless murmurs of villagers deepened. "The king calls her men," they whispered. "York raises his banners," others replied. Even the animals seemed unsettled, horses stamping at empty stalls, dogs barking at the chill in the air, as though some ancient instinct told them that the world was shifting beneath their paws. It was no longer a question if the kingdom would split, but when. Thus, the first sword stirred, not drawn, not yet flashing beneath the sun, but awakened. England stood at the threshold of a storm, still forming its first cloud. And you, gentle listener, now walk with me along this narrow path between patience and war. The winds are rising, faint but insistent, and the scent of battle, though distant, drifts like smoke from a fire not yet lit. Rest here a moment. Feel the hush before everything unravels. The next step the kingdom takes will echo across generations, and once taken, there will be no turning back. There is a moment, dear listener, when a storm no longer hides behind distant clouds, when it gathers its breath and begins to walk upon the earth. England reached that moment in the summer of 1455, when the long, breathless tension between York and the Queen finally found a shape, a place, a field upon which to speak in the only language the age would heed, the language of steel. Picture the early dawn, pale and shivering, stretching itself over the small town of St. Albans. The air was heavy with the scent of rain waiting to fall, as though the sky itself feared what it would witness. And beneath that trembling light, two armies moved like shadows rising from opposite ends of a dream. York's men calm and efficient, Lancaster's troops tense and unsure, each step echoing the heartbeat of a nation on the edge of awakening. Richard of York did not march that morning with the swagger of conquerors. His face, worn by sleepless nights, held a quiet sorrow, as though he wished more than anything that peace had chosen him instead of conflict. But peace, fickle creature that it is, often slips through the fingers of those who grasp it too gently. So York rode at the front, his banner fluttering like a pale ghost in the hesitant wind, followed by men who trusted his steadiness more than any crown. Meanwhile, the Queen's loyal forces gathered within the narrow streets of St. Albans, their armor clinking like distant bells. They believed they were defending the rightful throne, the rightful king, the fragile hope that order could be restored without bowing to the Duke whose influence had grown too wide for comfort. The first clash came not from a trumpet, but from an arrow, loosed by nervous fingers, carried by fate's quiet breath. It struck a shield, not flesh, yet that sound was enough to break the last thread holding back chaos. The battle erupted with a restless fury, spilling through the winding streets like a sudden flood. Houses trembled with the force of impact, shop doors splintered, cobblestones cracked beneath armored feet. Men shouted names of saints they hoped were listening. Others cursed the heavens for forcing their hands. And somewhere above, ravens circled lazily, as though unimpressed by humanity's noisy quarrels. The town's ordinary rhythm, market stalls, cheerful chatter, children chasing chickens, was swallowed by the roar of the realm's first true wound. Yet, in the heart of the tumult, there were moments strangely tender. A soldier paused to help a wounded enemy crawl to shelter. A young archer whispered an apology before releasing another arrow. Even war, brutal as it is, cannot wholly silence the fragile humanity that flickers in the corners of men's hearts. But tenderness cannot stop steel. As the fighting swelled, York's discipline proved stronger than Lancaster's chaos. His men pressed forward with the steadiness of a tide rising under a full moon. Soon the royal forces faltered, their lines bending like reeds in a gale. And in the swirl of dust and blood, a realization spread. Quiet at first, then sharp as a blade. This battle, however small, would mark the beginning of something immense, something neither side could escape. When the fighting finally stilled, the streets of St. Albans lay bruised and breathless. Victory belonged to York, though he carried it with no triumph in his eyes. The king, found unharmed yet shaken, was escorted back into York's care. An irony the heavens surely noted with a wry smile. And so the realm stepped across a line it could never uncross. The first blood of the Wars of the Roses had been spilled, not just the cobblestones, but the very heart of England. Tonight, as you rest upon this tale, feel the quiet hum of destiny shifting beneath your pillow. For this was only the first murmur of a storm that would soon roar with a terrible beauty.
The night before the execution had been strangely quiet, too quiet, as if the wind itself refused to carry gossip. But when dawn finally bruised the sky with pale gold, the town square woke like an old beast stretching its limbs. Wooden beams were dragged out, ropes tightened, and the scent of fresh-cut timber mixed with a faint bitterness of pitch. It was a smell people pretended not to recognize, yet everyone knew, today the flames would speak. There was no orchestra, only the shuffle of boots, the creak of wagons, and the uncertain breaths of those gathering. Men stood with arms folded, pretending to be brave. Women clutched shawls a little tighter,
Children peeked from behind skirts, eyes wide like curious sparrows forbidden from flying too close. And there, right at the center, waited the tall stake, rising like a final judgment carved from a tree that once knew gentler seasons. As the crowd thickened, murmurs spread in careful threads. "Is it true?" one whispered. "Did they really do it?" another replied. No one spoke too loudly. No one wanted their voice to be the one the morning remembered. Justice, after all, had a way of turning its head if you looked at it wrong. When the guards arrived with the prisoner, the whispers died as swiftly as candles in a storm. Boots marched in steady rhythm, and the condemned walked at their center, hands bound, posture straight, face carved from equal parts fear and dignity. The light caught the prisoner's features, and for a heartbeat, the world felt suspended. This was no monster, no creature from rumor or nightmare. Just a human being, fragile as anyone else under the sun. The ropes were tied. The wood groaned under the tension. A chill swept across the square, though the air was warm. Someone coughed. Someone prayed. And someone, near the back, muttered a half-hearted joke to ease their nerves, yet no laughter followed. In moments like these, humor fled like a frightened fox. The official stepped forward, unrolling a parchment with theatrical weight. His voice rang out, crisp and formal, as if reading a grocery list rather than sealing a life's fate. Each charge sounded heavy enough to bend the morning light. But the prisoner did not bow their head. Instead, they looked upward, toward the sky, toward the very clouds that drifted with maddening indifference. When the torch was brought near, a hush fell so deep, it seemed even the earth held its breath. Flames licked the kindling first, playful and small, then grew bolder, hungrier, reaching upward with crackling ambition. They wrapped the stake in orange coils, hissing like serpents born from fire and judgment. The crowd watched, some with tears, others with hardened faces carved by countless such mornings. A few stepped closer, as if needing proof that justice had indeed walked into the square. Others stepped back, ashamed of something they couldn't name. Fear, perhaps, or guilt, or the quiet realization that safety earned through flames never truly warms the heart. When the smoke finally thinned and the fire's voice died down, the square exhaled as one. People drifted away in slow waves, speaking carefully, if speaking at all. The sun climbed higher, shining innocently upon the charred wood, as though unaware of the weight it illuminated. And as the last embers dimmed, a soft truth lingered in the air like a stubborn ghost. The flames had not only judged the one bound to the stake, they had judged everyone who came to watch. When dawn broke the next day, it did so gently, almost apologetically, stretching pale fingers of light across the rooftops, as if afraid to disturb what the fire had left behind. The square, once roaring with heat and murmurs, now lay quiet under a thin veil of ash. The world wore a softer expression, yet beneath that calm surface throbbed the memory of yesterday's blaze. It lingered like smoke that refused to drift away. People walked slower that morning. Even the horses, usually eager to clatter along the cobblestones, seemed to place their hooves with more thought. Markets opened, but the chatter lacked its usual spark. Bread changed hands, fabric was measured, spices weighed, yet everything felt wrapped in cotton silence, as though the whole town were speaking in whispers, out of respect for something unspoken. At the center of it all stood the charred stake, now just a skeleton of wood blackened by judgment. No flames danced upon it, no ropes strained, No cries echoed. Only a faint line of smoke curled lazily upward, like a final sigh leaving the world slowly, reluctantly. Children avoided the sight, tugging their mothers' sleeves to take a different path. But adults stared just a moment longer than they needed to, as if the ash might answer the questions they dared not voice aloud. A pair of elderly men stood nearby, speaking quietly. "Strange thing," one murmured, scratching his gray beard. "How a fire meant to protect can make a man feel less safe." The other nodded, eyes fixed on the blackened timber. "Justice burns bright, but it casts long shadows." Their words drifted like dandelion seeds, carrying the town's uneasy mood with them. News of the execution traveled quick, riding through taverns and hearthside benches. Some insisted it had been necessary, a measure taken to shield the innocent. Others muttered doubts into their mugs, letting the ale swallow the rest. And still others claimed they saw omens in the smoke. Shapes, warnings, the old world whispering through the flames. In times of fear, even shadows grow tongues. By midday, workers arrived to clear the remains. They moved with careful steps, as if afraid the charred pieces might crackle back to life. Each plank lifted carried its own weight, not in wood, but in memory. The square gradually returned to its usual shape, yet something in its soul felt shifted. You can scrub away ash, but the scent lingers in the cracks where the water doesn't reach. Near the fountain, a young woman stood watching the cleanup, her shawl pulled close. Yesterday she had watched from the edges of the crowd, heart trembling beneath her ribs. Today, with the fire gone, she felt a strange hollowness take its place. She whispered to no one in particular, "I thought justice would feel cleaner than this." The wind answered with nothing but a cool sigh. As the sun climbed higher, the town resumed its rhythm, though slower, more thoughtful. A sense of caution wove itself into every step, every glance, every conversation. It was as if the fire had burned not only a life, but the illusion that simplicity ruled the world. Truth was more tangled, and everyone now felt the knots. And as the afternoon light softened toward gold, a final lesson settled over the square with gentle persistence. The fire may have died, but its echo, quiet, smoky, and stubborn, still followed every soul who had stood and watched. The evening crept in early that day, as though the sky itself wished to dim the world before anyone could look too closely at their own heart. Clouds drifted low and gentle, pale as old parchment, and the church bells gave a single solemn toll, one note long enough to tremble in the bones. It was the kind of dusk that made a person walk a little slower, speak a little softer, and wonder a little deeper about the weight they carried. Inside the old stone chapel, candles flickered in hesitant rows, their small flames dancing like souls unsure of their place. The scent of melted wax and damp stone filled the air. The villagers gathered, not for celebration, nor mourning, but for something quieter, something no one dared name aloud, the need to soothe a conscience that refused to stay still. They sat in wooden pews polished by generations of weary hands, and each face carried the same question, though no two lips would admit it. Had we done right, or merely what we feared not to do? Father Aldrich stood at the altar with a Bible resting in his palms like a fragile bird. His voice, when it finally rose, was calm but heavy, a river slowed by winter. "My children," he began, though half the people in the room were older than he, "we gather tonight not to judge the past, but to steady the soul that trembles when memory knocks." A few heads bowed, Others stared at their hands, the knuckles pale. Guilt can take many forms, some soft as a sigh, others sharp as a thorn buried in the heart. He spoke of faith, of duty, of the darkness that stalked the world and the light men must cling to. But even as he talked, his gaze drifted toward the window, where a thin line of smoke still rose from the square. It was faint, almost invisible, yet stubborn, like a ghost refusing to depart. And in his eyes flickered an unease he tried desperately to hide. Had righteousness become too familiar with fire? A woman in the front pew, widowed, young, quiet by nature, lifted her hand with a tremor. "Father," she whispered, "when fear guides our judgment, does faith still approve it?" A hush fell so complete that even the candles seemed to listen. Father Aldrich closed his eyes, exhaling slow. "Fear," he answered, "is a poor shepherd. It leads even the faithful astray." Her question settled over the room like snowfall, soft but cold enough to sting. Then from the corner an old man cleared his throat. He had been at the execution, standing close enough to feel the heat, but far enough not to admit it. "We watched because we thought we must." Another voice followed, quieter. "And now the fire feels inside us." The murmurs rippled through the pews, not loud, not accusing, just tired. A village unwrapping the truth it had been too frightened to touch. Father Aldrich lifted his hand, not to silence them, but to steady the tremor in the air. "The Lord knows your hearts," he said softly, "but knowing the heart does not free it from learning." It was neither comfort nor rebuke, just a truth, worn and honest. As the prayers drifted upward, carried by candlelight and trembling breath, the people felt something shift, not enough to absolve them, but enough to let them breathe. Outside, night wrapped the village in its cool embrace, and though the world grew darker, a quieter darkness stirred within each soul, whispering that the flames in the square were only the beginning of the burning they would come to know. Night settled thick across the countryside, deeper than ink and twice as silent. It was the kind of darkness that didn't simply cover the world, it listened to it. And after the prayers inside the chapel faded into memory, the villagers stepped out into the fields, brushed by moonlight, carrying with them the questions they had tried so hard to smother. The air smelled of earth and frost, and far in the distance, the lonely cry of an owl echoed, as if calling the name of someone long gone. The fields, usually welcoming in their simple silence, felt different now, like pages in a book that had been turned too quickly. Every rustle of grass sounded like a whisper. Every shift of wind felt like a breath at the back of the neck. And though no one said it aloud, many wondered whether the soul of the woman burned in the square might still wander here, following the paths she once walked, searching for the life that had slipped away too quickly. Fear and guilt often bloom in the same soil, and tonight both grew wild. A young shepherd named Rowan moved through the meadow with his lantern swinging at his side. His sheep huddled nervously instead of grazing, their ears twitching at shadows he could not see. Rowan frowned. Animals sensed things long before humans did. He knelt beside one trembling ewe, stroking her wool with a steady hand. "There now, no one's chasing you." But even as he spoke, he felt a prickling along his spine, an instinct older than reason, as ancient as the land beneath his feet. Lantern light flickered, and Rowan stood up slowly. Up on the ridge, a faint figure seemed to glide along the horizon, not quite shadow, not quite substance. His breath caught. For a heartbeat, he nearly called out, But the shape dissolved like mist the moment he blinked, leaving only the moon and the wind. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him with a tremor. Yet he could not shake the feeling that the night was paying closer attention than usual. Farther down the path, two farmwives carrying baskets of herbs paused near the old oak tree. "Listen," one whispered. The other held her breath. Between the sighs of the wind, there came a faint hum, soft, wavering, like someone singing a lullaby they had forgotten how to finish. "That's just the breeze," the braver one insisted. But the uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her. In a village where flames had swallowed a life only days before, even the wind could feel haunted. And so the night deepened, thick with murmurs. Some said the earth itself was grieving. Some said the soul of the condemned lingered to find peace. Others, those who still clung to superstition like a blanket, whispered that the devil took many shapes, and sometimes guilt tricked the mind into seeing what was not there. But no matter the explanation, the truth was simple. No one felt truly alone, even when the field stretched empty for miles. Yet amidst the unease, something else stirred, something gentler. A recognition that fear, once born, rarely sleeps quickly. A realization that the fire in the square had scorched more than wood. And as the villagers made their way home under the watchful moon, they carried with them a fragile understanding. The darkness outside was nothing compared to the darkness they had kindled within themselves. And still, the fields whispered on.
Morning arrived not with warmth, but with a thin, hesitant light that crept across the rooftops like a shy visitor, unsure whether it was welcome. The night's uneasy whispers still clung to the village, hanging in the corners of windows, lingering beneath eaves, hiding in the folds of curtains. Even before the roosters called, people woke with a peculiar heaviness, as though their dreams had been stitched from the same ash that once curled around the execution pyre. Doubt had quietly taken up residence in every home, tapping its knuckles against each fragile heart. Doors opened slowly that morning. Mothers stepped out to fetch water and glanced over their shoulders twice. Old men sweeping their thresholds paused often, staring at shadows that dissolved too quickly. Children, usually full of restless mischief, lingered near the hearths, clutching blankets as if the corners of their homes were safer than the open world. No words were shared, yet every face wore the same silent confession. Something has shifted. As though the village, bound by its own choices, no longer trusted the ground it walked upon. Down the narrow lane, a potter named Thalia arranged clay bowls outside her shop, though her hands trembled every time the wind rustled past. She had been among those who watched the execution from the very back, barely able to see, yet unable to look away. Today, as she shaped the clay, she whispered under her breath, "I used to think good and evil stood apart like night and day, but now they look so very alike." Her voice cracked, and a small bowl collapsed in her hands, the rim folding inward, as though it shared its uncertainty. She sighed and set it aside, letting it crumble quietly. At the far end of the village, the blacksmith, a man rarely troubled by anything beyond iron and ember, stood at the door of his forge without lighting the fire. His apprentice nudged him gently, asking what troubled him, but the man only shook his head. "I've swung a hammer for 30 years and I've never once missed the truth of metal. But people," he trailed off, rubbing soot across his brow, "people are softer. They bend under fear. Sometimes we call that shape justice." The apprentice, barely 15, looked down at his shoes. Youth often carries clarity adults forget, and even he knew the blacksmith wasn't speaking of metal. By midday,
Conversations swelled in corners, small, hushed clusters of neighbors leaning close. Some insisted the execution had been necessary. Others voiced their doubts in careful half-sentences. Did anyone truly see her curse the cattle? Or did we only see what we feared we might? Was she guilty or merely convenient? The words drifted like drifting embers, warm, fragile, dangerous. Even the church felt different. Its doors stood open, but fewer stepped inside. Faith, once a sturdy anchor, now felt like a question mark dangling from heaven's ceiling. Father Aldrich watched from the threshold as villagers walked past, their eyes averted. Doubt, quiet, persistent, had shaken more than their beliefs. It had shaken their trust in themselves. As the sun dipped low, casting long amber streaks across the fields, one truth hung in the air like a bell that refused to stop ringing. The flames had died, but the questions they awakened had just begun to burn. And so the village breathed in the slow, uneasy twilight, each soul listening for footsteps that were not there, each heart wondering whether the true witchcraft lay not in spells, but in the fear that had steered their hands.
Evening crept upon the village with the slow patience of a tide, washing the roofs in shades of violet and rose. It was a tender light, the kind that usually soothed the spirit, yet tonight it only sharpened the ache that had settled across every doorstep. Doubt had knocked in the morning. Now guilt pushed the door wider, stepping inside like an unwelcome guest who intended to stay. There are moments in life when the world feels heavier, not because it has truly changed, but because our hearts have. And tonight, the whole village seemed to walk beneath that unseen weight. In her small cottage near the river, old Marin sat by the window with her knitting needles resting silently in her lap. She hadn't touched them since the execution. The woman who burned, Elsbeth, had once brought her herbs for her aching joints. Simple leaves, harmless, gifts of kindness. Marin's fingers brushed the unfinished scarf, and a single whisper slipped from her trembling lips. If kindness were a crime, then perhaps we are all guilty. She blinked, and one tear traced the delicate map of her wrinkles, settling into the weave of her shawl. Across the village, young Rowan, the shepherd who had seen strange things in the field, paced the length of his family's barn. The lantern swung from a beam, casting ripples of amber light across the hay. "I didn't speak for her," he murmured under his breath. His sheep bleated softly, sensing his unrest. He sank onto a wooden stool, elbows on his knees. "A voice I didn't use feels heavier than a stone I can't lift." The words tasted raw, but true. Sometimes guilt doesn't shout. Sometimes it whispers until you finally hear your own silence. Meanwhile, the councilmen gathered in a dim corner of the tavern, their mugs untouched, their eyes far too sober. The decision to condemn Elsbeth had been swift, maybe too swift. Fear had guided them more than fact, more than reason. Yet none dared admit it openly, even to one another. "We followed the law," he said, his voice brittle. "Did we?" another murmured. "Or did we follow our shadows?" The room fell quiet, thick with the kind of truth that makes even candle flames hesitate. Outside, the wind moved through the streets like a wandering spirit, brushing against shutters, slipping under door frames, stirring memories no one wanted to face. Mothers tucked their children in early, whispering bedtime stories louder than usual, hoping their words might drown out the unease clinging to the night. Fathers lingered by the hearths, poking the embers again and again, seeking warmth, but finding little comfort. And at the church, Father Aldrich knelt alone, the candles around him burning low.
His prayer was not spoken aloud. It trembled within him like a wounded bird. He feared that faith, when wielded like a weapon, might cut deeper than any blade. Lord, teach us to see the living before we bury them. It was not a confession of sin, but of sorrow. The night deepened. Stars emerged like shy witnesses, scattered across the sky with cautious light. And the village, every home, every heart, felt the quiet truth settling in. The fire had taken one life, but their judgment had taken something from them all. There are wounds that heal, and wounds that teach. And this one would teach for a very long time. Night settled upon the village with a tenderness it had long forgotten, as though the heavens themselves wished to lay a cool hand upon a fevered brow. The stars shivered faintly above the rooftops, scattered like tiny lanterns guiding weary souls through the last stretch of darkness. The air was calm tonight, too calm, almost, like a page waiting for the final line of a story that had stretched across fear, fire, and remorse. And somewhere in that stillness, the village exhaled, as if realizing at last that the weight of the past could not be outrun, only understood. The square, once blazing with judgment, now lay washed in silver moonlight. Only the faintest outline of the stake remained on the cobblestones, as if time itself had softened the memory out of mercy. A young girl, no more than 10, wandered there with a small candle cupped in both hands. She had not witnessed the execution, but children sense the echoes adults try to hide. She knelt and placed her light where the ashes had been swept away, whispering a simple promise. No one should vanish without kindness. Her voice was barely louder than the night breeze, yet it seemed to settle gently over the square, like a blanket drawn across a restless sleeper. In the nearby cottages, families sat together in thoughtful quiet, not out of fear now, but reflection. They spoke softly, gently, as though their words might bruise the air if handled too roughly. One man, who had shouted the loudest during the accusations, stared into his cup and murmured, "I thought certainty was strength, but it blinded me." His wife placed a hand over his, not to absolve him, but to anchor him to the possibility of change. In that small, trembling moment, the first thread of healing was woven. Rowan the shepherd stepped into the square, lantern swaying at his side. He paused upon seeing the small candle left by the child. The warm glow brushed his face with a softness he hadn't felt since long before the execution. "She deserved gentler days," he whispered, voice catching on the truth he had carried for too long. Above him, the wind rustled as if agreeing, a quiet rustle, not eerie this time, but almost forgiving. Even Father Aldrich, who had stood torn between faith and fear, felt something shift as he walked the shadowed lane. He carried no Bible tonight, only his hands, clasped loosely behind his back, and a heart cracked open enough for humility to breathe. "If we must judge," he murmured into the moonlit air, "let us learn to judge with mercy first." The words wove themselves through the night, gentle as a hymn humming its final verse. And slowly, slowly, the village began to understand. The true darkness they had feared did not come from witches or curses or whispered spells. It came from certainty without compassion, from fear masquerading as righteousness, from the quiet corners of the human heart where shadows go unnoticed until too late. But dawn always waits. And as the eastern sky blushed with the first hint of morning, the village felt something lift, just slightly, like the beginning of release. The night had not erased their mistakes, but it had taught them how to see. And so, under the first breath of light, one truth finally settled upon every doorstep. Some stories are warnings, yes, but some are lanterns, guiding us not away from darkness, but through it, toward a gentler dawn. And now, dear listener, as the last embers of this long tale fade into the quiet of your room, let us rest our thoughts on the gentle truth hidden beneath its shadows. The story of that village, its fear, its fire, its trembling regret, reminds us that darkness is rarely born from witches or wandering spirits, but from the moments when we forget to look at one another with mercy. Fear can blind even the kindest of hearts. Judgment, when rushed, can echo louder than any spell. And a single flame, once lit by panic, can burn far more than the one it consumes. Yet there is hope in the lesson too, that understanding grows the moment we dare to pause, to breathe, to question our certainty, and to choose gentleness over suspicion. For in every era, in every village, and in every soul, light returns when compassion takes the lead. So let this story settle softly within you tonight, not as a weight, but as a lantern, glowing faint and warm, guiding your thoughts toward kinder grounds. Let it remind you that the world becomes gentler when we listen before we judge, when we hold one another with patience, and when we choose to see the human behind the fear. Now, breathe slowly. Let the night wrap you in its calm. Let your eyes grow heavy and your heart grow light. You have walked through shadows with me, and now it's time to rest. If this tale has carried you, comforted you, or stayed by your side even for a moment, you are warmly invited to join me again on Let Me Tell You, where every night another story waits to whisper you toward sleep. Until then, good night, and may peace settle gently over your dreams.